Hey guys, Pie Guy Rules here, and welcome back to another Square Theory. So, do mature topics, such as suicide, belong in SpongeBob? Now, there's two parts to this question. There's the does it belong in the comedy, and there's the does it belong in the story. I have different answers for both, so I will be addressing both differently. But before I can really get into my feelings about SpongeBob's more mature, darker humor, I need to talk about how I feel about dark humor in general. Now, I come from the school of thought that any topic can be funny. As long as you work really hard at the joke, as long as you're aware of what's in good taste and bad taste, as long as you craft it carefully, I think you can make any subject funny. There are certain subjects that are inherently more funny than others. I'm going to use the example of cancer. Cancer is not a very funny subject in general. There's nothing funny about the reality of cancer. But if you work really hard and you're clever with it, you can make a joke about cancer that is genuinely funny. And I think that a lot of people don't quite understand dark humor, and the point of it is not to say, let's laugh at that guy with cancer. The point of it is to say, cancer is a tough subject and a harsh reality of the world, and you kind of, laughing at it is okay, because what else can you do? You have no other control over it, so to laugh at it, you kind of take away some of the power it has over us as a society. Oftentimes, you'll see that the cancer patient will laugh the hardest at that dark joke because they know the situation and because they need it. They need to laugh. Laughing is the only thing they can do at this point. There's nothing else they can do to help themselves but try to feel a little bit better. And there are some people who will get offended, and there are some people who will get hurt and stuff, but, people are going to get offended no matter what kind of joke you make, and as long as I think the golden rule with joking about more serious topics is to not joke about anyone in particular, but instead joke about the topic. If you're going to come into your stand-up show and you see a guy that's, with a bald head and, he looks like he's been going through chemo, and you point him out and you're like, hey buddy, how's the cancer going? That's in bad taste. That's not going to go over well. That's a very mean joke. But if you're joking about the topic of cancer, you're not trying to single anyone out. You're not trying to make anyone feel bad. You're just trying to give a little bit of levity to what is ultimately a harsh situation. It's more laughing about the topic than it is laughing at someone's specific situation. And I think that's why I think it's acceptable. That's why I think it's funny. There's something inherently comedic about trying to insert comedy into a topic that just, wouldn't seem like a good place for comedy. That right there is just a juxtaposition that is automatically like a little bit funny in and of itself, even just before the joke is told. The intent of most comedians and most jokes told in that vein is usually not to hurt people. It's instead to make people happy and make people laugh. And sometimes good intentions, can still come out with a bad joke that is kind of offensive and too far. And sometimes there are just people out there that are just mean, nasty people that will make jokes at other people's expense. But speaking of mean, nasty people, in terms of dark humor, something else that I think a lot of people don't quite get is that when a comedian goes up on stage, and similarly when you see a character in a TV show that is just a bad person, they are a bad person, Eric Cartman, the joke of that person being a bad person, saying horrible, offensive things, the joke isn't that like, haha, man, I wish I could say that. No, the joke is, haha, I, the audience member, know that what they're saying is wrong and they shouldn't be saying it, but here's this idiot up here, here's this horrible person, holy cow, did they really just say that, haha. That's the joke, and I think a lot of people don't get that, and they take a lot of characters at face value, and they're like, oh, Eric Cartman is a bad influence on kids, and it's like, well, he's not supposed to be an influence on anyone. The joke is that he's a horrible, horrible little demon child. That's the comedy in there, and that's where the dark humor comes in. It's not necessarily that the people writing these characters believe what they're saying so much as they explicitly don't believe that, and you're supposed to find the comedy in how horrible that character is. But that's my feelings on dark humor in general. Now with SpongeBob, there is of course a little bit of a difference because SpongeBob is a show that's supposed to be acceptable for kids, so that comes with its own caveats. Do these mature subjects belong in the show's humor? I have to say, Yes, as long as it's done discreetly, as long as these jokes are well written. For example, there's the infamous to hero the doubloons, don't drop them joke. Now, that joke works because of how subtle it is. First of all, he's not even saying don't drop the soap. He's saying here's the doubloons, and he hands Scary soap, and he says don't drop them. You have to basically, realize that, okay, he's talking about the soap, and then you have to know exactly what the phrase "don't drop the soap" means. So it's not like it's super hidden, but you wouldn't get it unless you're kind of thinking about it. It's one of those clever jokes in that respect. And similarly, there's been other jokes on SpongeBob about suicide before. One of the ones that comes to mind is in The Great Patty Caper. When SpongeBob jumps off a cliff with Patrick in tow, Patrick is praying as if SpongeBob just threw them to their deaths. Of course, that's not the case, and SpongeBob had a contingency plan, but, the joke there is that Patrick thought that's what was about to happen. There's other jokes, like in Dungeons and Dragons. There's a joke where the guy that works at Medieval Moments, he's got his little spear and he points it towards himself and he's like, someday but not today. I didn't particularly find that joke funny, but I have to say that I'm not bothered by it because it's such a small joke, because it's kind of referencing maybe self-harm or suicide, but not explicitly. And because it's just a small part of the episode by a background character, so that's not a big deal. That's kind of a more subtle way to do that sort of joke. Now, when you compare that to something like the jokes in Are You Happy Now, which I explicitly didn't talk about in my review because I wanted to talk about it here, I do not like those two jokes. The jokes of Squidward sticking his head in the oven, and then he pulls out the cookies, and then Squidward hanging a rope over something because he's going to put up a pet. I don't like those jokes because of the context and because of how obvious they are. There's nothing subtle about either of those jokes. They're very blatant, like, haha, Squidward's gonna kill himself. Now, maybe in another context that would have been darkly funny to me, but in this one it doesn't work because Squidward is already so suicidally depressed. It's just not cool. It's uncomfortable. Going back to what I said earlier, the suicidal Squidward jokes aren't funny because they are about a person. Now, of course, it is a fictional person. I'm not deluded into thinking that Squidward is a real person suffering from real depression. Of course not. But he is still a character that we are supposed to empathize with, at least a little bit in this episode. We're supposed to care about what happens to him. I mean, otherwise the story is pointless. If we don't care about Squidward, then who cares? Like, it just, whatever. We're supposed to care about him in the episode, and yet they're making these jokes like, haha, wouldn't it be funny if he's killing himself? Or, haha, you thought he was killing himself, but he's not actually. Again, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with the jokes themselves, because the joke is that, like, he isn't killing himself. But I think the context in this episode, because Squidward is depressed and because if it were a real situation, you wouldn't be surprised to see someone in Squidward's situation, offing themselves, and that's awful, right? Like, I don't want to think about that, if you were to have these references in an episode that has nothing to do with it, like The Great Patty Caper, then that's okay, because you never really think that SpongeBob just threw Patrick to their deaths. It's all a joke. It's all a mislead. But you never quite believe it, and I think that's the key difference there, and that's why I think I almost called it Squidward suicide, but no, that's the creepypasta. That's why I think Are You Happy Now is in poor taste, whereas the references to suicidal misleads are in a lot better taste and can be funny, or at least just not bothersome, because the context is so ludicrous and you never actually even believe that it's actually related to suicide. So that covers the comedy side of it, but how do I feel about more mature themes in the stories of SpongeBob? Yeah, I don't think they should do that at all. Now, it's one thing if they want to have, like, an allegory where there's parallels, but it's not, the story isn't about that. I'm okay with that, but the story blatantly being about, Squidward being suicidal, or about Mrs. Puff wanting to kill SpongeBob, stuff like that, I don't think works for SpongeBob. I think they should stay away from it. However, if they wanted to do a story that's more serious, like, say, I don't know, SpongeBob's grandmother is dying, they would really have to do it in such a way that is different from like every other episode of SpongeBob, because the show has built up over, over a decade and a half of episodes that the most serious they ever seem to get, for the most part, is like SpongeBob loses his pet. And although, yes, losing your pet is a very serious and sad thing, it's not on the same level as trying to make an episode where Squidward is depressed or, touching on more mature subject matter in that way. And now, of course, it is time to talk about One Course Meal. Of course, I wasn't going to get through this entire video without talking about it, so here goes. Now, you know my feelings on the episode, and if you don't, I'll give you a little recap. I believe that the writers never really intended for that to come off as harsh as it does come off. Plankton lying down in the road. I think that was always meant to just symbolize Plankton giving up. And if you had substituted that scene with Plankton, instead of the road, just lying down in front of the chum bucket saying, like, I'm not gonna move, I'm just done. Or if Plankton had tried to comedically do something like that, like throw himself in the mouth of the whale, or, pack his bags and move out of town, or just kind of say, all right, I'm done. I think that the episode would be fine. Like, I think there'd still be story problems in other places, but it wouldn't be, offensive, or it wouldn't bother people as much as it does if Plankton had given up in another way. But seeing SpongeBob act the way he does, seeing Mr. Krabs act the way he does, and seeing Plankton act the way he does, all of that adds up to something that, yeah, is uncomfortable and definitely should not have been in SpongeBob. Regardless of whatever the intent was, unfortunately, it does come across as you have this severely depressed character who has now become literally suicidal, throwing himself in the road. SpongeBob cares, but not that much. He's not, like, begging Plankton to get out of the road. He's just like, I should probably do something about the situation. And Mr. Krabs is laughing. Like, that's why the episode is so unfortunate in that regard. If it had been anything different, and if it had been a little bit more silly and comedic and less, direct reference to how people can commit suicide, I think it would have played off a lot better than it did. So this video was sponsored by some Patreon people. It was a bonus goal a long time ago, so thank you to everyone who has ever donated to me on Patreon for making this video a possibility. Thank you guys so very much, and I would love to hear what you guys have to say on the topic. And with that, Pie Guy Rules out.